For generations, millions were told their origins began in Jerusalem. Then DNA told a different story. The belief connected Native American ancestry to an ancient family from the Near East. But genetic evidence pointed toward a much older history. And one question became impossible to escape. What happens when faith, ancestry, and evidence collide? A remarkable story shaped how many Latter-day Saints understood the origins of indigenous peoples in the Americas. It began around 600 BCE when, according to the Book of Mormon, a man named Lehi left Jerusalem with his family and eventually reached the Americas. His descendants became the Nephite and Lamanite, two peoples whose story would unfold through conflict, faith, survival, and collapse. But this was more than an ancient migration story. It became an explanation for the people already living across the Americas. And that created a problem, because humans had reached the Americas thousands of years before Lehi's supposed journey. So how did the Mormon story become connected to Native American origins? And what happened when archaeology, anthropology, and genetics began telling a much older story? Chapter 1. The people who came from Jerusalem. The story begins with a family fleeing a city on the edge of catastrophe. Jerusalem around 600 BCE was caught in one of the most dangerous periods of the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire had recently collapsed. Babylon was expanding rapidly. Judah stood between competing powers, and political instability was becoming impossible to ignore. Within decades, Babylonian armies would capture Jerusalem and destroy the First Temple. That is the historical world surrounding the opening of the Book of Mormon. The text places Lehi in Jerusalem shortly before this catastrophe. He receives a prophetic warning. His family leaves. They travel through the wilderness, eventually build a ship, and cross the ocean. For the people inside this story, there is no map showing what lies ahead. There is only the promise of another land. The journey moves them away from the political crisis of the ancient Near East and toward a continent whose peoples and civilizations would eventually become central to the Book of Mormon narrative. Then comes the division that would shape the entire story. Lehi's sons Nephi and Laman become the namesakes of two opposing peoples. At first, the conflict is painfully personal. It begins within a family, but the consequences extend far beyond it. Questions of leadership become questions of identity. Religious disagreement becomes political separation. And eventually, the descendants of the two brothers are portrayed as rival peoples, the Nephite and the Lamanite. Their relationship deteriorates. Wars follow, generations pass, and the conflict becomes more than a family dispute. It becomes a struggle over identity, religion, leadership, and survival. The Book of Mormon describes repeated cycles of warfare, political change, prosperity, collapse, and temporary reconciliation. The conflict becomes part of the identity of both peoples. But the Book of Mormon contains another migration story. The Jaredite are described as having arrived much earlier, in connection with the story of the Tower of Babel. Their story reaches back to an even earlier period. The Book of Mormon describes them forming their own civilization, separate from Lehi's family, and eventually being destroyed through internal conflict. Their civilization eventually collapses, and that creates an important complication. The Book of Mormon itself does not describe a simple story of one family arriving in an empty continent. It describes multiple peoples and migrations. That matters because the popular version of the story can sound much simpler than the text itself. Lehi is not presented as the first human being to ever reach the Americas. The Book of Mormon contains its own account of an earlier population, and that immediately opens a larger question about everyone else who may have been there. Yet centuries later, one question would become unavoidable. Who were these people supposed to be in relation to the indigenous peoples of America? That question would transform a religious story into an explanation of Native American origins. Chapter 2. When a religious story became an ancestry claim. The answer became increasingly clear among early Latter-day Saints. The Book of Mormon had given the Lamanite an ancient identity, but early Latter-day Saints increasingly applied that identity to indigenous peoples living in the Americas. They identified indigenous peoples of the Americas with the Lamanite described in the Book of Mormon. The connection wasn't merely theoretical. It affected how early church members understood the people they encountered. Missionaries were sent toward Native American communities with the belief that they were preaching to people connected to the Lamanite. The name itself carried enormous significance. Lamanite was no longer simply a word from an ancient record. It became a way of interpreting living communities. For early Latter-day Saints, that created a powerful bridge between Scripture and the present. The Book of Mormon told a story about ancient peoples. Native Americans were living in the same hemisphere, and the two were increasingly placed inside the same historical framework. The connection also became part of the way the Book of Mormon was understood outside the church. If the Lamanite were connected to indigenous Americans, then the Book of Mormon was making a claim about the ancient history of the Americas themselves. And this gave the migration story a much larger meaning. The Book of Mormon wasn't simply describing an ancient civilization. It was being understood as part of the history of the people living in America. But there was a problem hidden inside that interpretation. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were not a single population. They represented thousands of communities, languages, cultures, and political systems spread across two enormous continents. Their histories were already ancient, and the deeper researchers looked into those histories, the harder it became to explain them through one simple migration. The 1981 English edition of the Book of Mormon made the traditional connection especially visible. Its introduction described the Lamanite as the principal ancestors of the American Indians. That wording mattered. Principal suggested a major ancestral relationship. It placed the Lamanite near the center of the ancestry story. But the scientific investigation of the Americas was moving in another direction. Archaeologists were finding evidence of human occupation stretching far deeper into the past than the first millennium BCE. Anthropologists were documenting enormous cultural diversity, and genetics was offering something new, a way to look beyond written records, a way to investigate ancestry itself. The question was becoming harder to avoid. If indigenous Americans had deep population histories reaching thousands of years into the past, where did the people described in the Book of Mormon fit? Because thousands of years before Lehi's supposed journey, the Americas were already inhabited. The question was no longer simply what did the Book of Mormon say? It was becoming, what could the physical evidence actually prove? This documentary presents Latter-day Saint beliefs alongside historical, archaeological, and genetic evidence. Where interpretations or evidence remain debated, they are presented with appropriate context. The goal is to explore how this understanding of Native American origins has evolved, not to promote or dismiss matters of faith. Chapter 3: When DNA entered the story. The debate changed when scientists gained a new way to investigate the distant past. Not through scripture, not through oral tradition, not through assumptions, through DNA. For the first time, researchers could compare genetic patterns across populations and begin reconstructing relationships that existed long before written history. And the results pointed deep into the Ice Age. Genetic research has shown that the primary ancestry of indigenous American populations is connected to ancient populations of northeastern Asia and Siberia. That does not mean every indigenous nation has an identical genetic history. Far from it. The Americas became home to extraordinarily diverse populations over thousands of years. But the broad genetic picture revealed something crucial. The deepest ancestry of indigenous Americans was connected to populations of ancient Northeast Asia. Their ancestors were part of population movements through and around the Beringian region during the late Pleistocene. During the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower. A vast region connecting northeastern Asia and North America became exposed. This region, known as Beringia, was more than a narrow strip of land. It supported ecosystems capable of sustaining human populations. Over immense stretches of time, populations moved, became separated, and diversified. Eventually, descendants of these ancient populations spread across the Americas. The timeline was now impossible to ignore. The genetic history of indigenous Americans extended thousands of years before the period described in the Book of Mormon. And crucially, these migrations occurred thousands of years before the period in which the Book of Mormon places Lehi's arrival. That created a chronological problem. The Book of Mormon describes a migration from Jerusalem around 600 BCE. Genetic evidence points to a much deeper population history in the Americas. The difference isn't measured in centuries. It's measured in thousands of years. And this was not merely a difference in dates. It changed the question itself. If indigenous American populations already had deep ancestry connected to ancient Northeast Asia, then Lehi's migration could not simply explain the entire origin of those populations. The genetic record was pointing toward a much older foundation. But genetics raised another question. If a large population from the ancient Near East had become the principal ancestors of indigenous Americans, scientists would expect to find some recognizable genetic signal. But genetic research has not established a substantial pre-Columbian Israelite or ancient Near Eastern ancestry that explains the origins of Native American populations. That does not mean scientists can prove that no individual from the ancient Near East ever reached the Americas. Genetics cannot answer such a question with absolute certainty. Small migrations can disappear from the genetic record. Populations can mix. Ancestral signals can become diluted over generations. But that is different from finding evidence of a major population contribution. And that major signal has not emerged from the genetic evidence. The broad ancestry pattern continued pointing toward ancient populations connected to Northeast Asia. The evidence pointed somewhere else. And now the old question was becoming much harder to answer. Chapter 4. The words began to change. The story did not simply end when the genetic evidence became difficult to reconcile with traditional interpretations. Instead, the interpretation became more complicated. The LDS Church's 2006 Gospel Topics essay on Book of Mormon DNA studies acknowledged that genetic evidence does not support the idea that ancient Israelites were the primary ancestors of Native American populations. But the Church also emphasized a major limitation. DNA cannot identify the Nephite or Lamanite as distinct genetic populations. The Book of Mormon does not provide the kind of genetic information researchers would need to test its peoples directly. And genetic evidence cannot by itself determine whether a particular ancient religious narrative is historically or spiritually true. But the Church also argued that genetics cannot conclusively prove or disprove the Book of Mormon because the text does not necessarily claim that its peoples were the only inhabitants of the Americas. That distinction changed the conversation. The issue was no longer simply whether Lehi's family could have reached the Americas. The question became how many other people may already have been there. The Book of Mormon's own narrative had already described the Jaredite. Now the modern interpretation left room for still other populations whose histories were never recorded in the text. And then there was the wording. The older introduction had called the Lamanite the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Just one word changes the implication. Principal suggests a major ancestral role. Among leaves room for many other populations. The distinction is subtle, but historically it matters. The current wording no longer requires readers to understand the Lamanite as the principal ancestors of all American Indians. Instead, it permits a more complex ancestry in which Book of Mormon peoples could be among the ancestors of some indigenous Americans alongside other populations. The change does not erase the Lamanite. It changes the scope of the ancestry claim. The Church's modern explanation, therefore, allows the Book of Mormon peoples to have been only one part of a much larger population history. But this interpretation also leaves a difficult question behind. If other peoples were already present, who were they? And how much of the ancient American world can the Book of Mormon story actually explain? Closing reflection. The most revealing part of this story may not be whether one side defeated the other. It is what happens when people try to explain the past with incomplete evidence. For generations, people have used the evidence available to them to construct stories about where they came from. Religious traditions preserve meaning. Science tests physical evidence. History sits between them, constantly forcing old assumptions to face new discoveries. The Latter-day Saint story of Native American origins began as an explanation of where people came from. But the deeper history of the Americas turned out to be far older and more complicated than any single migration story could contain. And that complexity matters. Because indigenous peoples had their own histories, traditions, identities, and memories long before modern debates tried to explain them through someone else's framework. Their history did not begin with a 19th century interpretation. Their presence in the Americas reaches deep into the ancient past. And perhaps that is the lesson. The past does not change when we discover new evidence. Our understanding of the past does. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Mode Hub Tales as we uncover the forgotten histories, hidden cultures, and untold stories that shaped our world. Because history doesn't disappear, it waits to be remembered.